We designed this gun after it uses a Tech 9 receiver and a 3D printed frame and Glock magazines. We designed it after Attorney General Josh Shapiro tried to like shut down distribution of file sharing of 3D printable weapons.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Is he in Florida?
No, he's in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. And so what is the current status of people being able to make their own guns with a 3D printer?
Well, it's totally legal in most of the country.
But what about the whole background check requirement?
Most of the country, you don't need a background check to make your own gun. Like federally, you only need a background check to have a firearm transferred to you through a dealer, right? So when you are the genesis of the firearm, there's no transfer happening.
Right, from a federal level. And then what about, do states have their own?
Some states, so like California has some silly requirements that you have to get a serial number before it's made. Some other states have weird requirements, but federally, there's and it's like there's a good reason for it, because the federal government doesn't have the power to restrict purely intrastate activity,
even though it does it all the time.
Right. But they still sometimes like to at least pretend they recognize that.
Right. And then what about the bullets?
What do you mean?
Where do they come from?
The cartridges? Anywhere.
So the gun is made to be able to use standard bullets, in other words.
Yeah.
Glock.
Yeah, it takes a Glock magazine, takes regular old 9mm cartridges.
And what's the gun made out of?
This one is made of PLA plus. It's it's plastic. It comes in a roll. Here, I've got a roll of it right here. Damn it keeps doing that.
Yeah. And how would you compare it to a regular gun as far as its effectiveness?
Well, the guys that designed these have come really a long way. They're like, there's no problems with them. A lot of times, like this design, everything that's, under pressure is an original firearm component anyway. So we've put hundreds of rounds through this and haven't had a single issue.
How much is the 3D printer?
The minimum that you want to spend to get one that'll do guns is like $175.
Wow, is that cheap?
Yeah.
And then
we live in the future, man.
How about the materials to make the gun? What does that cost?
$20 a kilogram.
And that means how much for a gun then?
$7 or $8.
And it takes, though, how long to make one?
This one right here was printed out in 36 hours.
And that's because you're printing one piece at a time?
So how it is, it's like a hot glue gun. It's a fancy hot glue gun is what it is. So you have the filament, right? And you see this is like a little, it's fed in there. It's like a spaghetti. And it heats it up. And then the little nozzle extrudes it, like squirts it out very slowly, one layer, right? And then you do your layer, and then the whole level goes down by as little as, a fraction of a millimeter. Like I have it set to 0.15 millimeters. So it goes down. Then it does another 0.15 millimeter layer. It goes down. Then it does another one. So
the entire gun.
Yeah. So it does layer by layer. So right, it's your print head is moving in 2 dimensions. So it's just like kind of like a normal printer in that sense. But then it does another layer and another layer and another layer. And so that's how it becomes 3D.
So the thing is basically just running for 36 hours straight, making this thing.
Yep.
And out pops the gun.
Well, out pops the receiver. Then you have to. There's none that right now. And I have a lot of friends in the space, and they always get on me when I'm like, "Oh, there's nothing of this yet," and then they develop it. But there's none that I'm aware of right now that is one piece, single print job to where you run it and then you take out your complete gun. It usually requires some assembly and some tinkering.
How tricky is the assembly?
It depends. It can depend from, you needing to have like basically small machine equipment to this one that I've been showing you just need a little bit of filing, just a little filing to smooth out the rough edges, then slap it together.
And slap it together, meaning screw it together, glue it together?
Pins. This one had little pins. See,
Okay.
let's put all the things in together and put the pins in.
And
Yeah,
so
there were no screws on this one.
I presume you need to acquire a software program to run on the printer to build it.
Yeah, the printers generally have their own software. They're really simple. Uh, like basically the file you feed to the printer is specific to that printer. The software that's like kind of complicated is the slicer, which is what you put on your computer, and that goes from the 3D model and then slices it right into layers. And in those layers, there's instructions which are basically like move left, 300 millimeters, move up 300 millimeters, like that. And so yeah, that's your slicer software converts the 3D file into instructions for your machine, and then you just feed the machine the instructions. You just click on it and it spits it out.
And do you have to pay for that software?
There are some like really luxurious ones that are like $100, but usually they're free. I mean, the ones that most people use, Cura, which is free.
And you're pretty much assured to get on the FBI watch list by downloading that software, probably, right?
I mean, it's used, the same software is used for everything. So like the same people who are making, prostheses, the same people who are making, like little pen holders, or like I have a little business card holder that I 3D printed. We all use the same stuff.
Yeah, but specifically though, the software that says computer make this or printer make this gun, that's got to be obviously unique.
It's all the same. It's all the same. I use the same exact software to go from design to 3D object that you would for a business card holder or a pen.
Okay, but isn't somebody else designing the gun? You're not the one designing the gun.
Sometimes I do.
Okay,
but I'm a little weird in that way. But yeah, no, we there's all kinds of groups where people trade files, and just now DefCAD opened back up, so anybody can go online and download all the designs. And I think the FBI would probably like be more interested in you if you were developing medical devices than this stuff. But
well, I was being a little facetious on that. So what else have you made with your 3D printer?
I don't even know. I've had them. I was kind of like, I wasn't a super early adopter, but I was relatively early. I've been in it for like 5 years. I just do stuff like all the time. Whenever I think of something, like I was restoring an old lathe. I do some metalworking, and it didn't have a threading dial. And so I went online and I found a threading dial for another model, and I modified it to work with my lathe and printed it out. Like I said, a business card holder, a little stand for my phone, just little things that you don't want to order,
And where do you get the 3D printer? Can you get it on Amazon?
Yeah. Everybody should. I feel like everybody should have an Ender 3. The Ender 3 is $175, and it's able to. You can totally do guns with it.
You give me that name again, Ender?
Yeah, ENDER 3. That's not what I use. I use a Raise 3D N2, which is like, it's a couple years old, but it was a really advanced machine. But nowadays, the Enders for a couple $100 are totally enough.
And besides guns, what would you say they're primarily used for in people's homes?
Just whatever.
I mean, but is there anything in particular that kind of is a common thing that's it's really great for?
People really like making mounting stuff. People like to have solutions for like home organization and stuff like that. That's what I see mostly. And then like trinketry. People like I know the people who do like the trading card games like to have little figurines. There's a lot of that. I don't know. People use it for. I mean, it's kind of like asking, what do you use a printer for? It's gotten so advanced that it's really, I've used it to print out an auto part. My buddy has an old diesel Mercedes that needs these certain plastic rings, and we just print them out sometimes.
Well, guns rights people must certainly like them. We can use that to segue into specifically what we're talking about. You're probably very busy today. We know that a lawsuit was filed in California
Right.
on Friday. We've been ourselves questioning the constitutionality, not just of anything that shuts down gun stores, but these stay-at-home orders
Hmm.
and the limitation on personal liberty by the government ordering everybody to stay in their home. And maybe we'll get to that and talk about that a little bit also, just get your thoughts on that. But let's start with guns and start quickly at the beginning and then get to the specifics, because this is the first gun interview I've done for our show, and guns is an interesting issue. I personally am not a huge gun rights guy myself, but I'm a rule of law Constitution guy. So if the Constitution says you can have it, you have to have it. So let's start there and just read it for everybody. Everybody's heard this before, but I think it's a worthwhile place to start, which is the Second Amendment, which says that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This was written in a very odd way. And there's been multiple Supreme Court rulings about the meaning of the Second Amendment. And I know in particular, the Supreme Court has said that, yes, in fact, an individual has the right to have a gun. Even though it talks about a militia, they're not talking about the military or state National Guard or state military men being able to have a gun. We're talking about every individual having one, but it is worded in a confusing way that leaves open that argument. So let's just put a pin in that for a second, if we could. Why is it kind of oddly worded like this, where it talks about the militia, if the real intent is no, everybody's supposed to have a gun, be able to have a
Well,
gun?
it's really not oddly worded if you look at it in the way people wrote back then. And this has been pretty extensively studied. So what it is there's what's called a precatory clause and then the operative clause. So the reason you would do these clauses, and you see these in all kinds of state constitutions in other areas, right? Not just in the state right to keep and bear arms, but in like state free speech things. Whereas, like freedom of assembly being essential, or this or that. It's back then it was in fashion when you were doing something to start with an example, of why you might do something. So, like, if there was a right to, a specific constitutional right to cars, I think there is a right to cars, but anyway, if there was a specific constitutionally illuminated right to cars, and it started with convertibles being wonderful to drive on a summer day, the right to keep and own automobiles shall not be infringed. Would you say that, would you think that it only meant convertibles, or would you understand that, oh, well, they just liked those at the time, and that was one thing that you could do with cars? That's what it is in the Second Amendment.
So they're starting with the idea that, hey, a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state.
Hmm.
That's really just the preface. That's kind of the example.
Yeah.
And you have a comma, and then it says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So
Right. So a militia, which back then also regulated, didn't mean like checkboard warrior, making sure you've complied with all the stuff. Back then, regular meant to make regular, as in frequent, often, available. So that's what that meant then. But so yeah, a good state militia being one of the things that is a wonderful thing to have, it is thus required that we all be able to keep and bear arms, and that's the people. So like, and there's also an interesting definitional thing there too. So militia back then was defined as something like all men above above a certain age, except for some bureaucrats. So it wasn't like, the National Guard. This was, back, you had militia acts at the founding era, which just specified if you're above this age and you don't work in government, you need to keep a powder, pistol, this, that, and the other ready, and you need to come to militia practice. Uh, so there's that. And then there's the people, right? Which I think is written as succinctly as it possibly could be. It doesn't say citizens. It doesn't say, it doesn't say a specific race. It doesn't say a specific creed or a job title. It just says the people. So all of the people that are in the country have the right to keep and bear arms. And militias are one great thing that happens as a result of that.
And one of the thoughts was that a state, one of the 13 states, may have its own militia. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, all of the states were expected to have militias, and you'd have local militias as well. I mean, this was just a normal thing.
And what would you say was the purpose behind it? Because there's a lot of people that get confused about that or talk about different things. So is the purpose because people should be able to hunt and gather their own food through guns? Is the purpose because people need to be able to defend themselves against a criminal breaking into their home? Or is the purpose that we can't let the government become so oppressive that the people could never theoretically rebel against it? We rebelled against Great Britain and we used muskets in order to have a revolution and throw off an oppressive king. So is that what we had in mind, is that, hey, if the U.S. government becomes king-like at some point, even though we've done everything we could to guard against it through checks, balance of power, et cetera, that's what we need guns for?
So, like, there's a lot to unpack there. But the first thing I like to start out with is I say, you don't have a Second Amendment right. Your right to keep and bear arms is recognized by the Second Amendment. So I try to take it out of that context. So, like, I don't try to think of why we have the right to arms within that, several word framework. I think of it more broadly. And that's the way the founders thought of it. And in fact, the anti-federalists, they fought heavily against these amendments because they thought that, well, if you suggest that we have a right that can't be infringed, that suggests in the beginning that the government had the power to take your arms away in the beginning. So that's a really 1,000-foot overview of that. But as for why, well, yeah, no, there's no whitetail clause to the Second Amendment, right? There's no pheasant clause. And if we think of it in terms of hunting, which is incredibly frustrating to me, because we've tolerated such incredible restrictive regulations in the hunting context since the beginning of our society. I think that shows that hunting is something entirely separate from the right to keep and bear arms, right? Because for a long time, we've tolerated the government saying, all right, this is when you can hunt this animal, this is when you can hunt this, that doesn't sound like what we're talking about. What we're talking about is there's one simple way to look at it. Do you have the right to control your body against unlawful force? I think the answer is yes. And so that could be anything. Unlawful force could be anything. If the government is acting tyrannical, that's unlawful. It's unconstitutional. And so do you have a right to secure yourself against unlawful action of the government? I think so. Do you have a right to secure yourself against unlawful action of other people? Well, what's the government but a bunch of other people? So it all boils down to that. We have the right to protect ourselves against the worst day of our lives, against something horrible happening to us. And that's what it's all about. They had just gone through this horrible war with people that were their brothers shortly before, right, against what was their own government. And they recognized that this was people being treated inhumanely and unlawfully. And so there was no other choice but to use force.
And is it fair to say that you think that was the primary purpose of the amendment, was to allow the people to defend themselves against an oppressive government?
I would say, given what they had just experienced, and especially if you look at the events that led up to hostilities, guns didn't start going off until about when they started to try to seize arms and powder. So I'd say, yes, that was probably pretty fresh in their minds.
And secondarily, might be self-defense against somebody trying to steal from you.
Well, I'd say it's all self-defense. I'd say that self-defense against somebody, burglarizing you is the same at its core as self-defense against somebody acting under color of an order, doing something similarly violent and unlawful towards you.
Okay. So just to put a bow on this before we talk specifically about California and what's going on right now with coronavirus and these shutdowns.
Right.
Um, in the time of the Constitution, having guns was a good way to repel government oppression. What do you say about the fact that today weaponry has become so advanced that handguns or any type of guns are not going to be sufficient to be able to overthrow a government? Now you've got tanks, you've got planes, you've got nuclear weapons. I could go through the list of weapons that have been developed since the revolution that was fought with muskets. What do you say to people that say, well, at this point, the Second Amendment has become antiquated because of the advancement of weaponry, so we should either get rid of it for that reason, or we need to expand it and say not only are you allowed to have a gun, you're allowed to have a tank?
Well, I wouldn't call that an expansion. I would say that the Second Amendment probably does protect tanks as it's written. However, I would respond to that by saying,
By
okay,
the way,
huh?
has that been tested in the courts yet?
But I don't know if it's been fully tested, but who knows? Maybe we'll work on it. Because it says keep and bear, right? So keep must be something you can't hold in your hands. That's my theory. But so my answer to that would be to just that's like kind of a practical concern, which is how are you going to fight the government? They got F-16s. Well, I would say that the past 60 years, in this era of modern military, of super modern military, history has been pretty colorful with examples of motivated civilian populations using small arms to bring to its knees the most powerful fighting forces in the world, including ours. So I don't know. I don't think that makes it any different. If it made it any different, I don't think we'd still be playing around in Afghanistan today.
Well, I agree with the point you made, but I could take it even a step further. I mean, if you look at many revolutions these days, for instance, in Egypt, it wasn't people didn't even use handguns; they just poured into the streets, and you
Right.
shut down a city and a state simply by the people saying, "We're not working anymore, and we're going to jam your streets with people."
Well, yeah, and look at the Arab Spring, right? There were spurts of violence, but a lot of it was peaceful. Um, that you don't need to have a military win. You don't need to blow up tanks to get the hearts and minds of the people. In fact, all you need is the hearts and minds of the people to win in the long term.
But it sounds like you would argue that the Second Amendment protects not just guns, but perhaps even weapons beyond it, including a tank and including an airplane that can shoot a missile.
Probably. I think that there are probably some limitations, but like limitation in a different way. Not as in like, this is the caliber limit, but as in, is there can you use that equipment in a way that doesn't necessarily cause public harm? And like that's like kind of pointy-headed academic way of looking at it. But I don't think I don't think there is a like the right to keep and bear arms as long as you can you can use those arms in a responsible manner in an illegal way. I don't think there's a justification for banning them or locking people in cages for owning them.
But hasn't the Supreme Court ruled that you can restrict, for instance, automatic weapons?
Not quite. They didn't exactly say that. They What they said was is dangerous and unusual weapons may be able to be regulated, and that in time, they'll be able to discover that much. But in Heller, the court really didn't approve much. They left a lot to be reinterpreted. That said, if you brought a machine gun case to the Supreme Court today, do I think they would? Do I think they would rule in favor of the people's rights? I don't know, right? But I'm speaking from a theoretical perspective, from what the Constitution actually says, what the intent of that was, and how does a civil society that respects individual liberty function? And I think that if it doesn't matter what color your gun is or how it works, if you haven't done anything wrong with it, I think it's immoral and wrong to lock people in cages for owning them.
Yeah, well, most constitutional rights, if not all, are subject to some reasonable limitations. Here's a quote that I just kind of pulled. I think it was actually from the ACLU, but I think you'd probably agree with it. It says, no right is absolute. The government is always allowed to restrict the right if it can satisfy constitutional strict scrutiny and show the restriction is narrowly tailored to promote a goal of compelling importance. And that's been applied to the Second Amendment also by the Supreme Court, right? So it's not 100% absolute, reasonable restriction subject to strict scrutiny, narrowly tailored, usually is permissible.
So I question the concept of tiered scrutiny at its core. So a lot of law professors will tell you this is it, this is how it's been done, this is the way we view our rights. But it really, this way of looking at our rights is actually kind of new. And I don't know if it's the right way to look at our rights. I don't think they're, and so then that's the other question: how do you view a right? So, is your right to do something? I think it's exclusive of other people's rights. So you can take, your like being in the woods. Can you swing a hammer in any direction? I'd say probably yes, right? If you are free to do that, you are free to swing your hammer into any directions. But do you have the right to? And I would say, under a natural rights perspective, you have the right to swing your hammer in any direction until it touches another person or another person's property. So, but is that limiting your right? I don't think so. I think it's that your rights have to exist with other people's right. So I don't think there's a way to justify a ban on, suppressors, machine guns, short barrel rifles, or anything like that on their own. I think there might be a way to justify saying, you'll get extra years in prison if you use one of these in the commission of a robbery. But I think that if you just look at it by itself, like let's say you had a suppressor, a firearm suppressor on the table in front of you, and you hadn't filled out your paperwork and paid your tax. Where is the moral justification for the government coming and locking you away, right, for doing that? I don't see it. I don't see it until the very point where somebody else has been hurt. And so if you didn't hurt anybody and you had your rights taken away from you as a result of owning a weapon of any sort, I would say your rights were violated.
I gotcha. So, but anyway, broadly speaking, certainly the current state of the law for the most part is that constitutional rights can be subject to some reasonable limitations. So let's talk about what's going on in California and some other places. And I know there's been some very recent developments even over the weekend. So I'll get into specifics in a second. But generally speaking, what happened in California is a closing of all non-essential businesses, and gun stores were not considered essential. So in certain places in California, they've been closed, with the rationale being that this is a reasonable restriction because we have exigent circumstances. We've got an uncontrolled enemy, that being this virus that we need to control. So for the time being, we need to shut down gun stores. What's your thought about that being a reasonable restriction on your gun rights, considering this national emergency we face?
It's stupid.
Well put.
Yeah. So, and so, like, this gets into tailoring, like you were talking about. If the government, and so, like, if I'm to accept this, framework, if the government is to restrict rights, which in California it unquestionably has, is it in a way that is tailored narrowly, right? So it does the minimum it has to do to achieve its interest. Its interest is stopping coronavirus. Good luck, government. But so then let's say this. What does closing gun shops have to do with stopping coronavirus? Like keeping people away from each other, I understand that. However, people are already in contact in other ways, so this isn't narrowly tailored. Also, Does it take as little of the right as possible? Absolutely not. So in California, unlike in my home state of Florida, where we have other options aside from gun shops, we can buy from other individuals, other Floridians. We can make our own firearms without asking the government's permission. Like I have one whirring on the 3D printer behind me. Uh, you don't have those options in California. The government has said there is one way to get it, and you have to be funneled into this very narrow chasm, and then they shut the door. So that's a total elimination of your Second Amendment right to acquire a firearm. Uh, I don't think you can say that that's narrowly tailored in any sense of the imagination. They've completely taken away the right from anyone who didn't already have a gun during a time where people are most uncertain and where people there is actual fear of looting. Toilet paper has gotten pretty scarce, hasn't it? There's all kinds of fears. It's uncertain times, and these are the times where people need an effective mechanism of defense. So I would think that completely barring people from acquiring firearms is, as I said before, a bit stupid.
Do you think there's an ulterior motive to it?
Yes.
Which is?
I mean, this might shock your audience, but the government of California is not very gun friendly. I don't know if they've thought this far ahead, but in fact, I think they probably haven't, but this is what I've been thinking about. These people who are buying guns now, a lot of them are first-time gun buyers. People who have guns like me would not go and buy a gun right now because the prices are out of control. So now you've got all these new people who previously, a lot of them are probably the type of people who would say, I would never own a gun. I don't know why you would ever own a gun. Now there's a crisis going on, and they kind of understand why we own guns. That's going to cause a huge cultural shift in this country. There's going to be a whole new generation of gun owners as a result of this, who now can never say that they don't understand why you would want to buy a gun. I can see why people who are very devoutly anti-gun would want to stem that tide, but I don't really think that they are thinking that far ahead. I think they're just saying, not essential. I can't comprehend why a gun shop would be essential because I live in a nice neighborhood and I've never felt in danger. And so we're just going to shut them down.
Yeah, California generally, as you point out, people's right to bear arms not being on the top of their list of things to be concerned about.
Right.
The virus here, right, for people to have guns down here, shut them down. But to your point, I just heard coming in this morning, 12% of NYPD are home sick right now. And presumably that's only going to get worse. So as you point out, if there was ever a need for a gun for purposes of self-defense anyway, now would be the time. And yet California's shutting that down or attempting to.
Well, we're now starting to realize the cracks in the armor that exist. Like the government has made a lot of us think that, they've got everything under control at all times. But the limits of the system are being tested right now. Like you said, 12% homesick in a massive district. That's huge. And then we don't know how many other people are affected, right? Those numbers are probably going to explode in the coming weeks. So people are now forced to reckon with, okay, let's say the police force is down 12%, and there's let's say forget LA, but you're living somewhere in the middle of the country. There's an armed robbery somewhere, right? There's looting. Where are all of the cops in the city going to be? They're going to be answering that call. And now let's say during this horrible event, something happens to you. Do you, 100% of the time, are they going to be able to be there and help you? I don't think so. 95%? Sure. But people are now realizing about that, that possibility that you may have to take care of yourself. And, I don't think any of these people who are now lining up to get guns are doing it because they want to do anything bad with guns. I think they're doing it because they are seeing the chips in the armor. They're seeing that the state can't be there every single time something bad happens. And if something horrible were to happen, they just want to have an option.
Now, what about the oppressive government circumstances and that being a right to have arms? In emergency situations, that's when government oftentimes overreaches And I think there's a very good argument right now that the state of California has overreached. As we talked about, if you're going to violate somebody's constitutional right, it's going to be subject to strict scrutiny, and it better be narrowly tailored, to promote the goal. Um, the state of California has ordered everybody to shelter in place, even though the federal government hasn't asked that. The federal guidelines are basically to keep your distance and follow certain protocols. But the state of California says you're not allowed to leave your home. You're not allowed to tend to your property. You're not allowed to tend to your business unless it's essential. And now they've closed the beaches, and essentially the Pacific Ocean is now closed. I've got pictures of surfers getting citations from LA County sheriffs for surfing on the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
Is this
Yes.
overreach?
Oh, absolutely. And like that's another thing. It's not just about the right to keep and bear arms. There's a lot of First Amendment violations that are going on. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten curfews very heavily reviewed by the courts. I mean, the cases just haven't come up that much in our country's history. But now we obviously have the need for guidance there. It seems to me that the government has to at least provide an exemption for First Amendment protected conduct as well as Second Amendment protected conduct, at minimum, to have any of these stay-at-home orders be lawful. And the complicated thing is, it takes time to get your cases heard. And if, like, let's say the stay-at-home order is a First Amendment violation, which I think it is,
To right to peaceably assemble?
exactly, or the right to do your religious observations, anything, or just paint. I don't know. Let's say that the sheriff tells you no painting, right? You have to stay inside, and you sue. By the time your case gets heard, because half the courts are closed now too, the government's already stopped doing it, and they're going to say, "Oh, well, your case is moot." So that's something that really scares me. There's a lot of unquestionable violations that are happening right now that are at risk of being never heard in court.
Yeah. So normally you're able to go in, and if you can prove likelihood of success and exigent circumstances, you can get a temporary restraining order.
Right.
I know that's what you guys are attempting through what you filed on Friday, but you're talking about the courts possibly not being open. So let's get into the specifics of your case. You guys filed it on Friday. You were able to file it? The court was open to receive it?
Right. Yeah. I'm talking about the whole country. Yeah, we're seeing.
Okay. And you guys are trying to get a temporary restraining order against the state from enforcing this shutdown rule?
Well, yeah. So it's the state needs to, because the state has tried to like play this game of hot potato where they're like, oh, we're not going to make a call. The individual sheriffs get to make the call. We think that is like their behavior there is a violation. They should they should make the directive. No, obviously don't violate people's rights.
Yeah, let's take people through that history real quick. So the governor of California, Newsom, issues an order that says that everybody stay at home other than essential businesses, and then he points to a federal list of essential businesses. Gun stores aren't on there. So the county sheriff in Los Angeles says that gun stores are not essential. Then he gets some type of opinion, apparently, from a county attorney that says, well, no, actually they are. He reverses his order. Then Governor Newsom says that I'm going to leave it up to sheriffs to make the determination as to whether gun stores are essential or not. Right. And based on that, this LA County sheriff feels now emboldened that, oh, okay, the governor told me it's up to me. I say they're not essential. Right. Shuts them down. So, either they're essential or they're not. Governor Newsom just really punted it to the sheriffs, which seems kind of silly. But you guys sued the state of California nonetheless, along with the LA County sheriff.
Yes. And look, we all have a duty, right? And even me, right? I'm a lawyer. I swore an oath. We all have a duty to protect and uphold the Constitution. And everyone, the entire chain of command violated their duty here. That's as simple as it has to be.
So keeping with the specifics of your case, on Saturday, it's my understanding that the federal government, and this is, I think it's Homeland Security that's creating this list of essential businesses, they added gun stores to the list.
Right. Well, and let me pause you right there. I'm not sure they weren't on there to begin with, because a lot of these use, language, this federal language. It included shops that sell other supplies that are necessary for ensuring the safety of, homes. I think that that's what a gun shop is, right? And so I think it's arguable that they were already covered. However, yes, then now the feds came forth and clarified, and they went so far as to say the entire gun industry is essential.
And by the way, another point is whether they were covered or not doesn't change the fact that you have a Second Amendment right to do it.
Right. Yeah, yeah. No, because the government would probably not say that, um, if you ask them specifically what's essential during a time of crisis, would they necessarily say a church? I think it would depend on the official, but it doesn't matter. You have a First Amendment protected expression interest there.
So, but now if you look at Newsom's order, now that gun stores are expressly on the list, presumably that therefore changes Newsom's order, and Newsom's order no longer applies to gun stores. So has this mooted your case?
Well, so it's a little more nuanced than that, right? Because there are some counties, there are some places in the country that directly adopted the government list, and so the federal list. Uh, Newsom referenced it. Uh, so then there's the question of does that, does the updated list still, count? Is it binding? Those are open questions. I hope that we can just as quickly as possible get people's rights respected, but it's an open question as to what effect the update will have on the lawsuits.
Mm-hmm. It is a scary thought, though, to think how little our politicians think about our rights. And just, regarding anything, this is just a great example to talk about. But it's so obvious that they could have still protected our right to bear arms under the Second Amendment by putting an order in place that says that, okay, yeah, gun stores can be open, but any line into the gun store, you must be 6 feet apart.
Right.
X number of people within the gun store at a particular time. I mean, it's so
Or
easy.
even by appointment only.
By appointment only. I mean, it's so easy to think of ways to still protect against the virus, but allow the sale of guns, and to just so callously say, nope, not essential,
Yeah.
close. And even though Newsom himself hasn't ordered any to close, the fact that he would allow sheriffs to make their own decision, I mean, that almost seems to be the most. That's even worse, in my opinion, than Newsom saying that gun stores aren't essential.
Right. Yeah, that's him saying, I don't want to touch this. Right. But I mean, Newsom not wanting to touch a gun thing, I think that tells you it's pretty clear how wrong you are. And I mean, it's especially in California, man, it's like a slam dunk, like this is like, it's stupid. They shouldn't have done
California
this.
is not alone, right? Tell me what
No.
other states, counties, or cities have said that gun stores must close.
Well, in North Carolina, we've been, we're suing a temporary training, suing a sheriff who who stopped all pistol permit applications. We were prepared to sue the county, but they got back to us and we're like, whoa, no, okay, gun shops are essential. Uh, at least that's what they're saying they'll do. Uh, Louisiana, we've got a lawsuit pending. I mean, we've got stuff going on all over the place. I mean, if you guys are curious, I'd recommend you check out firearmspolicy.org, and you can see under the legal tab, we've got all the stuff listed out. But yeah, there's a lot going on, and we're sending a lot of letters.
Yeah, I know you guys are also asking people, so we'll ask our listeners to inform you guys. If they have if their particular city, because there's so many cities out there, if their particular city has banned guns, to inform you guys.
Yeah. Check out fpchotline.org. We've got a hotline set up. Basically, if you're a gun shop owner, you've been ordered to close down, or you're especially if you're one of these people who are wanting to buy a gun for the first time, but the city has ordered all the gun shops closed, we definitely want to hear from you, no matter where you are. it's very hard to keep track over all these city and county ordinances all over the place. And a lot of them are actually like, it seems like they're intentionally making themselves hard to find. So, if you've been subjected to that, we definitely want to hear from you.
And you guys have the resources to litigate all these cases.
Well, I don't know about all, but we're doing our best. We've got a lot of support. We've been working together with other gun rights organizations, including Second Amendment Foundation, the NRA. So we've been putting our everything we can down on the table just to protect the people, because I mean, to me, this is like a key example. Like, this is why I do what I do. People need to be able to protect themselves in a time of crisis. And right now is a time of crisis. So we haven't been getting much sleep.
So the one that will probably continue to get the most attention is the one that you filed in Los Angeles on Friday. Tell me, what is the status of that? When do you think you'll be in front of a judge arguing the merits of this on a temporary restraining order?
It won't be me. I'm only barred in Florida. So, but we have local counsel that's working on it. I don't know. Everything's up in the air right now with this stuff. But the good thing is that we've been acting quickly and getting these lawsuits filed, and getting the ball rolling. So we're trying our best to get everything done as quickly as possible. But that's like asking me to predict the election, and I learned in 2016 not to try to do that.
Well, I'm just thinking, under ordinary circumstances, if the courts were fully open, and my understanding is in Los Angeles is that they're open, they're not doing jury trials, but you can still have hearings in front of judges and so on. I happen to be dealing with a case in Quebec, Canada, and can say that Quebec is 100% closed. You can't.
Oh, really?
For any reason, unless it's a genuine emergency. So who knows what they're going to implement as things go by here. But based on my experience many years ago being a litigator, on a temporary restraining order, you can get in pretty quickly. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if you guys are having a hearing by the end of this week in front of a judge.
It would be nice. I mean, we've definitely been alleging, the exigent circumstances. We've definitely been doing, we've been basically making it clear this is an emergency. And there's also the issue that, like I was talking to you earlier about the standing thing. Like, this is something that is very serious and shouldn't be allowed to wiggle its way out on mootness. This needs to be handled now.
And presumably you would seek not just that the order be reversed, but that the gun stores receive damages for lost sales during that time?
I mean, I think it's hard to get those types of judgments, but I mean, under a tort theory, that would make sense, right? It's the directed and probable consequences of the action the government took.
And are you hearing anything about cases being brought saying that these shutdown orders are overly broad, that they're not narrowly tailored to fighting this virus, and that stay-at-home orders violate individual liberty, right to protect property? There's state constitutions and there's the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution, we've got the First Amendment, and then you've got right against, you got a takings clause. Arguably shutting down somebody's business is a taking. What do you think about cases like that? And are you hearing about any of them being brought?
So, like, as that all gets down to your theory of the case, which is heavily jurisdiction dependent. Because in places like the Ninth Circuit, we don't even know what tier of scrutiny Second Amendment cases are heard over, right? They claim it's intermediate, but we don't know in the Ninth Circuit how much tailoring is, like how much the judges care about tailoring. I certainly think it's relevant, but as far as how the cases are brought, we always make sure to go with the strongest theory for the jurisdiction. I mean, like, I would, me personally, I would want to see a case that was won on the Commerce Clause, against a federal, prohibition. But
the federal government, I think, has been very careful about what they've issued. Just over the weekend.
Oh yeah.
Talking about a quarantine of New York and New Jersey, and then he ends up not doing it. I think most likely he chose not to do it because he was advised it's not constitutional.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody probably pulled him aside and said, "No, no, 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 stop it." Like that's
Right. And the federal guidelines are just that. They're really just guidelines. It's up to the states and the cities, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. And I think that we're going to be getting into very interesting times here when,
yes.
say, the federal government decides, okay, I think it's time to allow people to start going back to work and so on, but the individual governors say, no, it's not. And the
Right.
ones that have the authority, or more authority anyway than the federal government to shut things down.
Yeah, no, it's a really this whole situation is just so fascinating, and especially because, like, it's a situation where there's a virus where the primary target, right, the people most at risk for it are generally the same people that are in the political class. So it's just a fascinating way it's developing, and I think that, like you're saying, once the feds, and also, like, I mean, who really cares what the feds think on the matter? But once they think it's time to pull back, and right, go home, and I would hope that that would be supported by scientific analysis. Uh, it would be up to, like, the personality of the governor to decide whether or not to take that, and that's why this is also problematic.
Yeah, they're definitely basically allowing this panic to overreach and decide that this is the role of government. The people can't be trusted. We've been told keep 6 feet of distance from each other and wash your hands and cough into your elbow. But they got a photo from a helicopter of one of the popular hiking trails in Los Angeles, which, my gosh, showed people crossing paths with each other on the hiking trail. And my gosh, if you measured it, it was less than 6 feet. And like, we can't trust people to
Hmm.
follow these guidelines, so we better just shut everything down. That's really what they're doing. They're saying we can't trust the people to follow these guidelines, even though you could make the guidelines
Right.
mandatory to keep 6 feet distance. But rather than doing that, they're just saying, no, we just got to shut the whole thing down.
Yep.
The mountains in Los Angeles are closed, the beaches are closed, and essentially the Pacific Ocean is closed.
I mean, this is really, and look, I'm not going to downplay the significance of this virus. It's very serious, and it's changed all of our lives, probably permanently. However, when this virus wasn't happening, people scuba dove, right? I'm a scuba diver. That's massively dangerous. You know, it, I choose to do it, and we choose to just, people take risks, right? People choose to engage in risky activity. I do think it's very odd the degree to which we have accepted the government in intervening in our risk-taking behavior. At the end of the day, you know, I do think at a certain extent, you should set guidelines. People should generally follow them. The 6 foot thing, it's pretty rational, right? I do it. But if somebody chooses to engage in risky behavior, I think at some point you got to just say, all right,
Yeah, automobiles being the most obvious example that
right,
restrict that. But yeah, it's not, you got to you got to balance reducing the spread of this virus with, in my opinion, two things. One is total destruction of your economy, which could cause even more damage. Everybody talks about that. But the second thing is, if this is how we're going to react anytime this happens, are we going to be able to go through this again a year from now when there's another one? Can we afford another $2 trillion bailout and another $20 trillion hit to our economy? How many times can we do that? I think we're exposed now. We are exposing ourselves by demonstrating that this is how we react. And I hate to even mention it or talk about it, but I'm just saying that there could be nefarious actors out there that say, oh, okay, we see how to bring the great Satan to his knees.
Yeah, I mean, that those are all rational concerns. I mean, we haven't had something like this since the Spanish flu. And of course, like, our understanding of virology back then was very different. What I really worry about is, people have been very just okay with everything happening. They've been generally just very okay with saying, oh, curfew, all right, fine, as long as it'll protect me. People have been very okay about all that stuff. Does that mean that our trigger is going to be lower? Does that mean that next time, because the way these viruses work, right? Like you were saying, next year there's a very high likelihood that a year from now there will be another run around. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Or is it next time that, like, it would be, you remember we've lived through the swine flu, avian flu, SARS, all these different things, and we took precautions, but nothing like this. Does that mean that in the future, when some like less serious, not quite as pandemic virus comes up, they're just going to feel empowered to shut the light switch off? I don't know.
Yeah. And what's scary is it's just very politically incorrect to suggest that we shouldn't all be sheltering in place. And, time will tell whether we took proper measures or
Right.
not. But I just think that there aren't enough voices questioning what these governments are doing.
Yeah, and it's hard, right? It's very hard to talk about this because I am sheltering in place, and I think people generally should be keeping apart. And I think that if somebody were to, go out and, I don't know, line dance or whatever, I'd feel a little uncomfortable with them. I'd be a little annoyed with them, but I don't think it's my right to stop them. I think we exercise our rights to keep our distance and keep ourselves protected if that's what we want to do.